14-year-old Aiden Fucci sat in the back of a St. Johns County Sheriff's Patrol car, his wrists bound by handcuffs, his future hanging by a thread he refused to acknowledge. But instead of fear, instead of the dawning horror that should accompany such a moment, the teenager raised his hands beside his face, flashed 2 peace signs at his phone's camera, and posted the image to Snapchat with a caption that would shock a nation and seal his fate in the court of public opinion long before any jury could be seated. "Hey guys," the caption read, "has anybody seen Tristan lately?" The girl he was asking about, 13-year-old cheerleader Tristan Bailey, was at that very moment lying dead in a shallow wooded area less than 2 miles from where he sat, her young body bearing the evidence of a brutality so extreme that even veteran investigators would struggle to comprehend it. She had been stabbed 114 times. And the boy in the back of that patrol car, the boy with the peace signs and the smirk, knew exactly where she was because he was the one who had put her there. This is the story of how a community's innocence was shattered, how a mother's misguided loyalty became criminal complicity, and how a teenage killer's arrogance became the instrument of his own destruction. The Durbin Crossing community of St. Johns County, Florida, was the kind of place that appeared in real estate brochures and suburban dreams. Located just south of Jacksonville, this master-planned neighborhood represented everything that young families sought when they imagined the perfect place to raise their children. Tree-lined streets wound through carefully manicured developments, each home a testament to middle-class aspiration and the promise of safety. The community boasted pristine parks, well-funded schools, and the kind of neighborhood watch programs that existed more as social clubs than necessities. Because serious crime simply did not happen here. Violent crime was something that occurred in distant cities, something glimpsed on evening news broadcasts before being dismissed with a shake of the head and a silent gratitude that such things happened elsewhere. The residents of Durbin Crossing had paid a premium for this illusion of security, and for years, the investment had seemed sound. Children rode their bikes until sunset. Teenagers walked to friends' houses without escorts, and parents slept soundly knowing their sons and daughters were protected by the invisible force field of affluent suburban existence. But that force field was about to be shattered by one of their own. A monster who had been hiding in plain sight. Nurtured in the very heart of their community, Tristan Bailey was, by all accounts, the embodiment of everything Durbin Crossing represented. At 13 years old, she was a 7th grader at Patriot Oaks Academy. A competitive cheerleader whose smile could light up a gymnasium, and a daughter who made her parents proud in all the ways that mattered. She was small in stature but enormous in spirit. The kind of girl who befriended the lonely kids at lunch and cheered the loudest for her teammates, even when she was on the sidelines. Her social media accounts painted a picture of typical teenage girlhood, filled with selfies with friends, cheerleading videos, and the innocent vanity of someone just beginning to discover who she was becoming. She was not perfect, because no 13-year-old is. But she was good in the ways that would later make her loss feel like an amputation of the community's soul. She had dreams of high school cheerleading, of college, of a future that stretched out before her with all the possibility and promise that youth affords. Her bedroom walls held posters of her favorite athletes. Her closet contained the uniforms of a girl who threw herself into every activity with wholehearted enthusiasm, and her phone held the text messages and social media exchanges of a typical teenager navigating the complex social waters of middle school. None of it suggested that her life would end before her 14th birthday, stolen by someone she considered a friend in a community that was supposed to keep her safe. Aiden Fucci had lived in the same community, attended the same school, and moved through the same social circles as Tristan Bailey. At 14, he was just a year older, a classmate and acquaintance whose presence in her life had seemed unremarkable. But beneath the surface of this seemingly ordinary teenager lurked something far darker than anyone had recognized or been willing to acknowledge. Those who knew him described a young man of contradictions, someone who could be charming when he wanted something but cold and dismissive when he did not. There were whispers among classmates of a cruel streak, of a fascination with violence that manifested in disturbing ways, and of a detachment from normal emotional responses that made some instinctively uncomfortable in his presence. Teachers had noted behavioral issues, a defiance of authority that went beyond typical teenage rebellion, and a seeming inability or unwillingness to connect with the consequences of his actions. His social media presence, which investigators would later comb through with meticulous attention, revealed a young man who seemed to romanticize darkness, who posted content glorifying violence and expressing a nihilistic worldview that should have raised alarms, but was dismissed as teenage edginess in an era where such content was depressingly common. His home life, which his defense would later attempt to weaponize in service of mitigation, was marked by instability. But it was not the poverty or neglect that typically featured in such narratives. His mother, Crystal Smith, was present but permissive. A parent who seemed to view her son through a lens of denial so thick that warning signs became invisible. She would later prove just how far that denial extended when she made a choice that would land her in a prison cell of her own. The evening of May 8, 2021, began like countless other Saturday nights in Durban Crossing. The Florida air was warm and humid, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and the distant chlorine tang of neighborhood pools. Teenagers congregated in the way they always did, gathering at homes when parents were away or lenient, seeking the social connections that define adolescence. That night, a small group had assembled at a house in the neighborhood, a loose collection of friends and acquaintances whose paths had crossed through school and proximity. Tristan Bailey was among them, having slipped out of her home in the late evening hours in the way that teenagers sometimes do, seeking adventure and connection in the liminal spaces between childhood and adulthood. Aiden Fucci was there too, carrying with him a hunting knife that he had shown off earlier in the evening, a weapon whose presence should have alarmed but apparently did not. The gathering was not particularly eventful by teenage standards, just a group of kids talking, laughing, and navigating the complex social dynamics of their age. But as the night wore on, the group began to disperse, and Tristan found herself walking home in the early morning hours of May 9th, accompanied by Aiden Fucci, on a route that would become her last. What happened next would only fully emerge through investigation, forensic analysis, and eventually Aiden's own admissions. But the broad strokes painted a picture of horror that defied comprehension. At some point during that walk, in the darkness of the early morning hours, Aiden Fucci attacked Tristan Bailey. The assault was not the result of an argument that escalated or a moment of passion that got out of control. It was premeditated, calculated, and executed with a savagery that spoke to something profoundly broken in the young man's psyche. He stabbed her not once, not twice, but 114 times. The number itself seemed almost impossible, suggesting a duration and intensity of violence that went far beyond any rational motive. Tristan fought for her life, her small hands bearing the defensive wounds of someone desperately trying to ward off the knife that kept coming, her last moments filled with terror and pain that no child should ever experience. When it was over, when her struggles finally ceased, Aiden dragged her body into a wooded area near a retention pond, a location that would be discovered by searchers less than 24 hours later. He left her there, in the darkness, and returned to his life as if nothing had happened. The morning of May 9th brought no immediate alarm to the Bailey household. The realization that something was wrong came gradually, then all at once. Tristan's parents, Stacy and Matt Bailey, had not known she had slipped out the night before, and when they discovered her absence in the morning, concern began its slow escalation into panic. Initial attempts to reach her phone went unanswered. Calls to friends yielded no information about her whereabouts. The digital trail that usually connected teenagers to their parents had gone cold, and with each passing hour, the fear grew. By mid-morning, the Bailey family had contacted the Johns County Sheriff's Office to report their daughter missing. What began as a routine missing persons call, the kind that often resolves itself when teenagers return home sheepishly from unauthorized adventures, quickly took on a more ominous character as the hours passed without any sign of Tristan. The community, initially hopeful that this was simply a case of a teenager losing track of time, began to mobilize in the way that close-knit neighborhoods do when one of their own is in danger. The search for Tristan Bailey quickly became an all-hands effort that demonstrated both the strength and the vulnerability of the Durban Crossing community. Neighbors who had never spoken to each other formed search parties, combing through parks, wooded areas, and retention pond perimeters that dotted the neighborhood. Social media became a coordination tool, with posts about Tristan's disappearance spreading rapidly through local groups and garnering shares from people far beyond the immediate area. Flyers with her photograph were printed and distributed, her smiling cheerleader portrait becoming a symbol of hope and fear simultaneously. The street. Johns County Sheriff's Office deployed significant resources, treating the case with a seriousness that reflected their growing concern. Investigators began the painstaking work of reconstructing Tristan's last known movements, interviewing friends, checking surveillance footage, and following the digital breadcrumbs that teenagers inevitably leave in their wake. The community held its breath, caught between hope and dread, united in a desperate desire to find this girl alive and bring her home safely. The break in the case came not from the organized search parties or the sophisticated investigative techniques, but from the digital confession of the killer himself. Aiden Fucci's Snapchat post, the one where he flashed peace signs and asked if anyone had seen Tristan, had been screen captured and shared before he could delete it. The image spread through the teenage social networks of Durban Crossing like wildfire, its callous tone immediately striking many as suspicious. Tips began flooding into the sheriff's office, with multiple young people pointing to Aiden as someone who had been with Tristan the night before, someone who had been behaving strangely, and someone whose social media posts seemed less like concern and more like a taunt. Within hours, investigators had focused their attention on the 14-year-old, pulling surveillance footage from homes and businesses along the routes he might have traveled, constructing a timeline that would become increasingly damning. The footage told a story that Aiden could not explain away, showing him walking with Tristine in the early morning hours, and later, returning alone. The discovery of Tristan's body came in the early afternoon of May 9th, ending the hope that had sustained the search and beginning a new phase of grief and investigation. A search team, guided by the emerging information about Aiden's movements, focused their efforts on a wooded area near a retention pond in the neighborhood, a location consistent with the timeline investigators were building. There, hidden in the underbrush, they found her. The scene that greeted the first responders was one that would haunt them for the remainder of their careers. The brutality of the attack was immediately apparent, the sheer number of wounds speaking to a violence that defied understanding. Crime scene technicians worked methodically to document and preserve every piece of evidence, knowing that what they were recording would become the foundation of a murder prosecution. The medical examiner would later catalog the 114 stab wounds, noting the defensive injuries on Tristan's hands and arms that told the story of her desperate, futile fight for survival. The murder weapon, Aiden's hunting knife, was recovered nearby, its blade still bearing the evidence of its terrible use. The arrest of Aiden Fucci came swiftly, the evidence already overwhelming before the forensic analysis was even complete. Investigators descended on his home with a search warrant, finding a residence that would yield further damning evidence and reveal the depths of parental complicity that would later become its own scandal. Aiden himself was taken into custody with remarkably little resistance. His demeanor, one of detached indifference that unnerved the officers who apprehended him. There was no tearful confession, no expression of remorse, no attempt to explain or justify what he had done. He answered questions with the sullen monosyllables of a teenager inconvenienced, rather than the desperate pleas of someone whose life had just irrevocably changed. His Snapchat post, the one that had helped lead investigators to him, had already defined the narrative in the public mind, and his behavior in custody did nothing to challenge that perception. Here was a young man who had committed an act of unspeakable violence and seemed utterly untroubled by it. A teenage killer whose conscience appeared to be as absent as his victim's pulse. The interrogation of Aiden Fucci was a study in adolescent sociopathy that left even experienced investigators disturbed. In the controlled environment of the interview room, with cameras recording and parents notified, detectives attempted to understand what had driven this seemingly ordinary teenager to commit such an extraordinary act of violence. Aiden's responses were alternately defiant and dismissive, his attitude one of superior amusement at the efforts of adults he clearly considered beneath him. He offered partial admissions wrapped in self-serving narratives, attempting to minimize his culpability even as the evidence against him mounted. He suggested that the attack had not been his idea alone, that others had been involved. Accusations that investigators would thoroughly examine and ultimately dismiss. He showed no grief for Tristan, no acknowledgement of the suffering he had caused, no connection to the reality that he had ended a human life. His primary concern seemed to be the inconvenience of his situation and the unfairness of being caught. A perspective so divorced from normal human emotion that it read as either mental illness or something far more chilling. While Aiden sat in juvenile detention, the investigation continued to expand in directions that would shock the community almost as much as the murder itself. When investigators had executed their search warrant at the Fucci residence, they had seized surveillance footage from the home's security cameras, a routine step in any such investigation. What that footage revealed, however, was anything but routine. The video showed Aiden's mother, Crystal Smith, in the early morning hours after her son had returned home, taking his jeans and placing them in the washing machine. These were the jeans Aiden had been wearing during the attack, jeans that were stained with Tristan Bailey's blood. Crystal Smith, knowing that her son was already a suspect in the disappearance of a neighborhood girl, had made the conscious decision to destroy evidence, to wash away the blood of a murdered child in an attempt to protect her own. The footage was clear, damning, and ultimately criminal. It revealed a mother whose protective instinct had crossed the line from loyalty into complicity, from denial into obstruction of justice. When investigators confronted her with the footage, she had no adequate explanation, no justification that could make sense of what she had done. Crystal Smith was arrested and charged with tampering with evidence, her mugshot joining her son's in the gallery of faces that would come to represent this tragedy. The community of Durban Crossing reeled from the cascading revelations, each new detail another blow to their sense of safety and understanding. The murder itself was incomprehensible enough, but the knowledge that a mother had actively worked to help her son escape justice, had washed away the blood of a child she surely knew, added a layer of horror that seemed almost medieval in its darkness. Vigils were held for Tristan, her cheerleading teammates gathering in their uniforms to mourn one of their own. Their young faces streaked with tears they could not fully understand. The Bailey family, whose world had collapsed in the span of a single day, faced the cameras with a grief so raw it was painful to witness. Matt and Stacy Bailey became reluctant public figures, their private tragedy now fodder for national news coverage, their daughter's life and death analyzed by strangers who would never know her smile or her laugh or the way she lit up a room. They spoke of Tristan with the broken reverence of parents whose love had nowhere left to go, their voices steady even as their hearts crumbled, determined to ensure that their daughter was remembered for who she was rather than how she died. The legal machinery began to turn with a speed that reflected the strength of the evidence and the community's demand for justice. The state attorney's office, after reviewing the case, made a decision that would define the rest of Aiden Fucci's life. They announced that the 14-year-old would be charged as an adult, bypassing the juvenile justice system entirely and subjecting him to the full weight of adult criminal consequences. The decision was not made lightly, but the factors weighed heavily in its favor. The premeditated nature of the attack, evidenced by the knife Aiden had brought to the gathering and shown off before the murder, demonstrated criminal sophistication beyond what the juvenile system was designed to address. The brutality of the assault, with its 114 stab wounds, spoke to a depth of violence that was not an impulsive act, but a sustained, deliberate campaign of destruction. And Aiden's behavior after the murder, his callous Snapchat post and his lack of remorse, suggested a psychological profile that offered little hope for rehabilitation within the limited time frame the juvenile system could provide. The charge was first-degree murder, carrying a potential sentence of life in prison. At 14 years old, Aiden Fucci was facing the possibility of dying behind bars. The pretrial period was marked by a flurry of legal maneuvering, media attention, and the slow revelation of details that painted an increasingly disturbing portrait of the defendant. Aiden's defense team, court-appointed lawyers tasked with the unenviable job of representing an apparently remorseless child killer, began constructing their strategy around the only viable path available to them: They could not credibly claim innocence. Not with the physical evidence, the surveillance footage, and their client's own partial admissions. Instead, they would attempt to mitigate, to humanize, to argue that whatever Aiden had become was the product of failures beyond his control. They investigated his background, searching for the trauma and neglect that could explain, if not excuse, the monster that had emerged. They retained psychological experts who would examine his brain and his history, looking for the developmental deficits and environmental factors that might engender some sympathy in a jury that would otherwise see only the crime. It was a long shot, and everyone knew it, but it was the only shot they had. The prosecution, led by State Attorney R.J. Larizza and his team, was assembling a case that was as straightforward as it was devastating. The physical evidence alone was overwhelming. Tristan's blood on Aiden's clothing, the murder weapon recovered from the scene, the surveillance footage documenting his movements, and his own statements to investigators all pointed unambiguously to his guilt. But beyond the mechanics of proving the case, the prosecution was also building a narrative about who Aiden Fucci was, a portrait that would counter any attempt by the defense to portray him as a victim of circumstance. They gathered evidence of his prior behavior, the troubling incidents that had been dismissed or minimized by adults who should have recognized the warning signs. They documented his social media presence, the posts that glorified violence and celebrated darkness. They prepared to present the Snapchat photo, that searing image of arrogance and contempt, as the clearest window into the soul of the defendant. And they coordinated with the Bailey family, ensuring that when the time came, the jury would understand not just what Aiden had taken from the world, but who Tristan Bailey had been and what her loss meant to those who loved her. Crystal Smith's case proceeded on a parallel track, her charge of evidence tampering a lesser but still serious crime that would result in her own reckoning with the justice system. The surveillance footage was irrefutable, her actions clearly documented, her intent unmistakable. She had known, or at least strongly suspected, what her son had done. And her first instinct had been not to contact the authorities, not to ensure justice for a murdered child, but to protect her son by destroying the evidence that would convict him. Her defense team attempted to portray her as a mother acting on instinct, overwhelmed by shock and fear, making a split-second decision that she would regret forever. But the community saw something else in her actions, something that felt like a betrayal that went beyond the legal charges. She had washed away Tristan Bailey's blood, had tried to help her son escape accountability for 114 stab wounds, had chosen her child over the basic demands of human decency. When she eventually pleaded guilty, accepting a sentence of 3 years in prison, many in the community felt it was not nearly enough. As the months passed and the trial date approached, the case continued to dominate local and national news coverage. Every pre-trial hearing was covered by cameras, every legal motion analyzed by talking heads, every new revelation absorbed by a public that could not look away from the horror even as it recoiled from it. Aiden Fucci's face became familiar to millions, his mugshot and that damning Snapchat photo seared into the collective consciousness as symbols of teenage violence and parental failure. True crime podcasts devoted episodes to the case, YouTube channels created detailed timelines, and social media communities debated every aspect of the evidence and the appropriate punishment. Through it all, the Bailey family maintained their dignity. Their public statements focused on honoring Tristan's memory rather than feeding the spectacle of their tragedy. They established a foundation in her name, advocating for stronger anti-bullying measures and youth mental health resources, attempting to find meaning in their loss by preventing others from suffering the same fate. Their grace in the face of unimaginable pain became its own story, a counterpoint to the ugliness that had consumed their lives. The question of motive remained the subject of speculation and investigation throughout the pre-trial period. What could possibly drive a 14-year-old to stab a 13-year-old cheerleader 114 times? The prosecution would argue that the question itself was, in some ways, irrelevant, that the law required only proof that the act was premeditated and intentional, not that its motivation be fully understood. But for the public, for the community, and for the Bailey family. The question of why was central to making any sense of the senseless. Various theories circulated, some based on evidence and some on speculation. There were suggestions of a romantic rejection, of social media conflicts, of the random targeting of a vulnerable victim by a predator seeking to satisfy dark urges. Investigators who examined Aiden's digital history found a pattern of concerning interests, a fascination with violence and death that suggested something was deeply broken long before the night of May 9th. But ultimately, the full truth of what drove Aiden Fucci to such extreme violence remained locked in a mind that showed no inclination to reveal it, a black box that would never fully open. In the months leading up to trial, the prosecution made a decision that would prove decisive in shaping the outcome. They offered Aiden Fucci a plea deal, an opportunity to avoid the uncertainty and spectacle of a trial by pleading guilty to first-degree murder in exchange for the prosecution not seeking the maximum available sentence. For a 14-year-old charged as an adult with first-degree murder, the stakes could not have been higher. A conviction at trial could result in a life sentence with no possibility of parole, while a negotiated plea might offer at least the theoretical possibility of eventual release. The defense, recognizing the overwhelming nature of the evidence against their client, urged Aiden to consider the offer seriously. But Aiden Fucci, true to the arrogance that had defined his entire engagement with the legal system, initially resisted. He seemed to believe, with the irrational confidence of youth, that he could somehow prevail at trial, that the same cleverness that had led him to post that Snapchat photo would somehow allow him to escape the consequences of his actions. It was only after sustained pressure from his legal team, and perhaps a growing realization of the reality he faced, that he finally agreed to accept responsibility. The day Aiden Fucci entered his guilty plea was a moment of anticlimax and catharsis simultaneously. The courtroom was packed with media, legal professionals, and members of the public who had been following the case. The Bailey family was present, their faces masks of controlled emotion as they prepared to hear the words they had been waiting for. Aiden was led in wearing the jail attire that had replaced his borrowed suits, his demeanor still carrying that unsettling flatness that had characterized his entire engagement with the proceedings. When asked how he pleaded to the charge of first-degree murder, he responded with a single word that echoed in the silent courtroom like a gunshot: guilty. The word hung in the air, a moment of finality that closed one chapter and opened another. He had admitted to the world what everyone already knew, that he had taken Tristan Bailey's life with premeditation and malice, that he was responsible for the 114 wounds that had ended her existence. But the plea was not the end of the story. It was merely the transition point, the moment that shifted the focus from guilt to punishment, from the question of whether he had done it to the question of what would be done with him. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for several weeks later, a period that would be filled with preparation and anticipation on all sides. The prosecution prepared to present the full impact of Aiden's crime, the evidence of its brutality, and the testimony of those whose lives had been shattered by his actions. They would call witnesses who could speak to who Tristan was, what her loss meant, and why the maximum sentence was the only appropriate response to such an offense. The defense prepared to present whatever mitigation they could muster. The psychological evaluations and background information that might humanize their client enough to argue against the most severe punishment. They knew the odds were against them, that a young man who had stabbed a cheerleader 114 times and then posted a smirking selfie about it was not a sympathetic figure, but they were obligated to try, and the Bailey family prepared to face their daughter's killer in open court, to deliver the words they had been composing in their hearts since the moment they learned of her death, to speak for Tristan one final time before justice was rendered. The weeks before the sentencing hearing were a time of quiet intensity for all involved. The media spotlight had dimmed slightly after the guilty plea, the narrative having reached what seemed like its natural conclusion. But everyone knew that the final act was yet to come. Tristan's friends and family gathered their thoughts, writing and rewriting the impact statements that would attempt to convey the inconveyable, the depth of loss that words could only approximate. The prosecution team coordinated their presentation, determining the order of witnesses and the evidence that would be displayed, building toward a crescendo of emotional and factual impact that would leave no doubt in the judge's mind about the appropriate sentence. And in his jail cell, Aiden Fucci waited, his state of mind known only to himself, his thoughts on the impending reckoning hidden behind the same impassive facade he had maintained throughout. Whether he felt fear, remorse, or simply the boredom of incarceration was impossible to tell from his external presentation, which remained as flat and effectless as it had been since his arrest. The morning of the sentencing hearing dawned bright and clear, the Florida sun indifferent to the human drama about to unfold in the St. Johns County Courthouse. Lines formed early outside the building, members of the public and media representatives jockeying for the limited seats available in the courtroom. Security was tight, the emotions surrounding the case creating a charged atmosphere that required careful management. Inside the courtroom, the stage was set for the final act of this tragedy. The judge's bench, presiding over a space that would soon echo, with testimony designed to shape the rest of Aiden Fucci's life. The prosecution table was organized with binders and exhibits, visual aids that would remind everyone present of the brutality of the crime. The defense table was more sparsely appointed, the limited options available to Aiden's lawyers reflected in the modest stack of documents before them. And the gallery was filled with faces that would become familiar as the day progressed: the friends and family of Tristan Bailey, the curious observers, and the journalists whose reports would carry the outcome of this hearing to millions beyond the courtroom walls. The sentencing hearing began with the kind of procedural formality that belied the emotional devastation contained within. The courtroom walls. Judge R. Lee Smith took his seat at the bench, his expression carrying the weight of a man who understood that the words he would speak at the end of this proceeding would determine whether a teenager would ever again walk free among society. The gallery was packed beyond comfortable capacity, every seat filled with observers whose reasons for being there ranged from professional obligation to personal grief to morbid curiosity about the resolution of a case that had captivated the nation. The air itself seemed heavy, thick with anticipation and the accumulated sorrow of months of mourning. In the front rows sat the Bailey family. Their faces composed masks of determination that barely concealed the volcanic grief beneath. Stacy Bailey clutched a folder containing the words she had written and rewritten 100 times. Words that would attempt to convey to a court of law what her daughter had meant and what her loss had cost. Matt Bailey sat beside her, his jaw set in the manner of a man who had learned to hold himself together through sheer force of will, knowing that any crack in his composure might become a flood he could not control. Beside them sat Tristan's grandparents, aunts, uncles, and the friends who had become family through shared tragedy. A wall of love and loss that would soon make its voice heard. Aiden Fucci was led into the courtroom by deputies, his hands shackled in front of him, his jail-issued clothing, a stark reminder of the institutional existence that had become his reality. He shuffled to his seat at the defense table, his eyes scanning the room with that same unsettling detachment that had characterized his entire journey through the legal system. If he felt the weight of the moment, the gravity of the proceedings that would determine his fate, it did not register on his face. He glanced at the Bailey family without apparent recognition of the pain his actions had caused them, his gaze sliding past them as if they were furniture rather than the people whose lives he had destroyed. His defense attorneys, seated on either side of him, wore the expressions of professionals who knew their task was nearly impossible, but were determined to fulfill their ethical obligations regardless. They had spent months trying to find the human being beneath the monster, searching for the psychological explanations and mitigating circumstances that might justify something less than the maximum sentence. Today, they would present whatever they had found, knowing that it would likely be insufficient to counter the overwhelming evidence of their client's callousness and cruelty. The prosecution opened the hearing with a methodical recitation of the facts of the case, establishing for the record the foundation upon which their sentencing recommendation would rest. Assistant State Attorney, R. J. Lariza rose from his chair with the measured confidence of a man who knew his case was unassailable, who understood that the evidence he was about to present would speak with a voice louder than any argument the defense could offer. He began by describing the evening of May 8, 2021, guiding the court through the timeline that had been reconstructed through witness statements, surveillance footage, and forensic analysis. He spoke of the gathering where Aiden had displayed his knife to other teenagers, the weapon he would later use to end Tristan Bailey's life. He described the walk that Aiden and Tristan had taken in the early morning hours, the last journey of a young girl who had no idea she was walking toward her death with her killer at her side. His voice remained steady and professional, but the words themselves carried an emotional weight that needed no enhancement. The facts were damning enough without embellishment. A story of premeditated violence that defied any attempt at justification or excuse. When Laritza reached the description of the attack itself, the courtroom fell into a silence so complete that the hum of the air conditioning system seemed deafening. He did not sensationalize the violence, did not attempt to shock with graphic language, but the simple recitation of the facts was horrifying enough. 114 stab wounds. The number hung in the air like an accusation. A numerical representation of savagery that the human mind struggled to process. Laritza explained what the medical examiner had found. The pattern of wounds that told the story of a prolonged and relentless assault. He described the defensive wounds on Tristan's hands and arms, the evidence of a young girl fighting desperately for a life that was slipping away with every thrust of the blade. He noted the locations of the wounds, the areas of the body that had been targeted with particular fury, painting a picture of violence that went far beyond what would have been necessary to simply end a life. This was not a killing born of a moment's rage that quickly subsided. This was a sustained, deliberate act of destruction that continued long after its purpose had been achieved. A window into a psychology so dark that even experienced prosecutors struggled to comprehend it. The prosecution then turned to the evidence of premeditation, the legal element that elevated this crime to first-degree murder and made the maximum sentence not just appropriate but essential. Laritza presented the testimony of witnesses who had seen Aiden with the knife earlier in the evening, who had heard him make statements that, in retrospect, revealed a mind already contemplating violence. He showed the court the Snapchat messages recovered from Aiden's phone, communications that demonstrated a fascination with death and a casual attitude toward human life that predated the murder by months or even years. He played excerpts from Aiden's interrogation, moments where the defendant's lack of remorse was so complete, so absolute, that it seemed to exist in a different moral universe from the one inhabited by normal human beings. And then, saving the most damning piece of evidence for maximum impact, he displayed the photograph that had come to symbolize the case in the public mind. The image of Aiden Fucci in the back of the police car, flashing peace signs, smirking at the camera while Tristan's body lay undiscovered in the woods. The caption, that cruel, taunting question about whether anyone had seen Tristan lately, was displayed beneath the image, the words burning themselves into the consciousness of everyone present. The presentation of the physical evidence continued with clinical precision, each item another link in the chain that bound Aiden Fucci to his crime. Photographs of the murder weapon were displayed. The hunting knife that had been recovered near Tristan's body, its blade still bearing traces of her blood, despite Aiden's cursory attempts to clean it. Forensic reports were entered into evidence, documenting the DNA analysis that matched the blood on Aiden's clothing to the victim, the fingerprint evidence that placed the knife in his hands, and the digital forensics that tracked his movements through cell tower data and surveillance footage. The prosecution presented the testimony of the investigators who had processed the scene, men and women who spoke in the measured tones of professionals, but whose eyes betrayed the impact of what they had witnessed. One detective, a veteran of 2 decades on the force, paused momentarily when asked to describe finding Tristan's body, his composure cracking just slightly before he collected himself and continued. These were not just pieces of evidence being presented. They were fragments of a nightmare being reassembled before the court, a mosaic of horror that revealed its full picture only when all the pieces were in place. The shift from evidentiary presentation to victim impact statements marked a change in the emotional temperature of the courtroom that was almost physical. The judge announced that the court would now hear from those who wished to speak on behalf of the victim and her family, and a ripple of anticipation passed through the gallery. These statements would not present new facts or legal arguments. They would do something perhaps more important. They would restore humanity to proceedings that had, of necessity, treated a murdered child as an evidentiary matter. They would remind everyone present that Tristan Bailey was not just a name in a case file, not just a victim in a legal proceeding, but a daughter, a sister, a friend, a cheerleader, and a dreamer whose future had been stolen by the young man sitting at the defense table. The first to speak was Tristan's mother, Stacey Bailey, who rose from her seat with a dignity that seemed almost supernatural. Given the circumstances, she walked to the podium that had been positioned before the judge's bench, her folder of prepared remarks clutched in hands that trembled only slightly, and she began to speak. Stacey Bailey's voice started soft, almost fragile, but it gained strength as she continued, fueled by a mother's love that death itself could not diminish. She spoke first of who Tristan was, not as the victim of a crime, but as the light of her family's life. She described her daughter's infectious laugh, the way it would fill a room and make everyone around her smile without knowing why. She talked about Tristan's dedication to cheerleading, the hours of practice, the competitions, the way she would come home exhausted but exhilarated, already planning for the next event. She remembered the small moments that had seemed ordinary at the time but had become precious beyond measure in retrospect. The way Tristan would climb into bed with her parents on weekend mornings, the way she would text silly memes throughout the day just to stay connected, the way she would hug her little brother even when he pretended to be annoyed by the attention. These were not the dramatic memories that make headlines. They were the quiet moments that make a life, and they were gone forever. The grief in Stacey Bailey's voice deepened as she turned from who Tristan was to what her loss had meant. She described the morning when they realized their daughter was missing, the growing terror of those hours, when hope still existed, but was steadily draining away. She spoke of the moment when investigators came to their door with the news that every parent dreads, the words that ended one life and fundamentally altered all the others connected to it. She talked about the night since then, the sleepless hours spent staring at the ceiling, the dreams that brought Tristan back, only to have her ripped away again upon waking. She described the daily reminders that ambushed her when she least expected them. The empty seat at the dinner table, the bedroom that remained exactly as Tristan had left it because changing anything felt like a betrayal, the cheerleading competitions where the team performed with one member missing, a gap in the formation that could never be filled. Her voice broke multiple times during this portion of her statement, but she pressed on, determined to complete what she had come to do. When Stacey Bailey finally turned her attention to the defendant, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. She looked directly at Aiden Fucci, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that he could not maintain, his gaze dropping to the table before him for one of the few times during the proceedings. She did not scream at him, did not hurl insults or curses, though no one would have blamed her if she had. Instead, she spoke with a cold clarity that was perhaps more devastating than any display of rage could have been. She told him that he had taken not just a life but a future, the decades of experiences that Tristan would never have, the woman she would never become, the family she would never create. She told him that he had stolen not just a daughter but a piece of every person who loved her. She told him that she did not understand how a human being could do what he had done, could inflict such suffering, and then pose for a smiling photograph as if it meant nothing. And she told him that while she struggled every day with anger and hatred, she refused to let those emotions consume her, because to do so would be to give him power over her life that he did not deserve. Her final words were not for him but for the court, a plea for the maximum sentence not out of vengeance, but out of a desire to ensure that no other family would ever suffer what hers had suffered at his hands. Matt Bailey followed his wife to the podium, his demeanor that of a man who had aged decades in the months since his daughter's death. Where Stacey had channeled her grief into controlled eloquence, Matt's pain was rawer, closer to the surface, his voice thick with emotion that he struggled to contain. He spoke of the unique bond between a father and daughter, the protectiveness that had been his instinct from the moment Tristan was born, and the utter failure he felt for not being able to protect her when it mattered most. He described the guilt that haunted him, the irrational but inescapable feeling that he should have known, should have been there, should have somehow prevented the tragedy that had taken his little girl. He talked about the hole in his heart that would never be filled, the conversations they would never have, the milestones he would never witness, the walk down the aisle at a wedding that would never happen, the grandchildren he would never hold. His voice cracked repeatedly, and at several points, he had to stop entirely, collecting himself, before continuing with a determination that was painful to witness. Unlike his wife, Matt Bailey did not attempt to understand or rationalize his feelings toward the defendant. His words were harder, edged with an anger that he did not try to hide. He looked at Aiden Fucci and saw not a troubled teenager, but a predator who had chosen to end an innocent life for reasons that made no moral sense. He spoke of the cruelty of the attack, the 114 wounds that meant his daughter had suffered, had felt pain and terror in her final moments, while her killer continued his assault without mercy. He referenced the Snapchat photo, his voice rising as he described the contempt he felt for a young man who could murder a child and then joke about it on social media. He asked the court to impose the maximum sentence, not because he believed any punishment could ever be adequate, but because society needed to make clear that such acts would be met with the full weight of justice. His statement ended with a direct address to the judge, a father's plea for the only form of justice that remained available, the assurance that the monster who had killed his daughter would never be free to harm anyone else. The victim impact statements continued throughout the morning, a procession of grief that painted an ever fuller picture of what had been lost. Tristan's grandparents spoke of the grandchild who would never visit again, the holidays that would forever have an empty place at the table. Her cheerleading coaches described a dedicated athlete whose spirit lifted the entire team, whose absence had left a void that no new recruit could fill. Friends took the stand in pairs, supporting each other through statements that captured the everyday magic of teenage friendship, the sleepovers, and the secrets and the plans for a future that would never arrive. Teachers remembered a student who was kind, engaged, and full of potential that had been violently extinguished before it could be realized. Each speaker added another dimension to the portrait of Tristan Bailey, transforming her from a name in a case file into a fully realized human being whose loss was immeasurable. And through it all, Aiden Fucci sat at the defense table, his expression maintaining its disturbing flatness, occasionally whispering to his attorneys but showing no visible response to the parade of pain that his actions had caused. The prosecution's final argument was a masterful synthesis of fact and emotion, a summation that wove together the evidence of the crime with the impact it had wrought. Lareza rose once more and addressed the court with the weight of everything that had been presented behind him. He reminded the judge of the premeditation, the brutality, and the complete absence of remorse that had characterized this crime from its commission to the present moment. He pointed to the defendant and described what the evidence revealed about his character. A young man whose fascination with violence had been documented long before he acted on it, whose behavior after the murder demonstrated a callousness that defied any claim of youthful impulsivity or momentary loss of control. He argued that the maximum sentence was not just appropriate but essential, a statement by society that such acts would be met with the most severe consequences available. He spoke of public safety, noting that a person capable of stabbing a child 114 times and then posting a smirking selfie about it was a person who should never again be free to walk among potential victims. And he concluded with a simple, powerful statement that seemed to echo in the silent courtroom long after the words had faded. Tristan Bailey was 13 years old. She had her whole life ahead of her. The defendant took that life, and he has shown not one moment of genuine remorse for doing so. Justice requires that he never have the opportunity to take another. Aperty, not of live. When the defense rose to present their case for mitigation, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted subtly. Everyone present understood that Aiden Fucci's attorneys faced an impossible task, that nothing they could say would undo the damage of the evidence and testimony that had preceded them. But the defense attorneys were professionals, bound by ethical obligations to advocate for their client regardless of personal feelings, and they approached their task with the somber dedication of doctors performing surgery on a patient they know will not survive. Their strategy was to humanize without excusing, to provide context without justification, to argue that even a monster had once been a child, and that the making of that monster involved failures beyond his control. It was a delicate tightrope walk over a chasm of moral outrage, and everyone watching knew that a single misstep would send them plunging into the void. The defense began by presenting testimony from a forensic psychologist who had evaluated Aiden over several sessions in the months since his arrest. Doctor. Patricia Holloway took the stand with the careful demeanor of an expert witness who understood the hostile environment she was entering. She described Aiden's psychological profile in clinical terms, speaking of developmental deficits, attachment disorders, and a profound inability to process empathy that suggested neurological, as well as environmental factors. She testified about his home life, the instability and dysfunction that had characterized his upbringing, the absence of consistent parental guidance, and the presence of enabling behaviors that had allowed his antisocial tendencies to flourish unchecked. She did not excuse his actions, was careful to emphasize that understanding was not the same as absolution, but she attempted to place them in a context that might engender something other than pure condemnation. It was a valiant effort, but the faces in the gallery showed that her words were making little impact on hearts that had been closed by the weight of Tristan Bailey's memory. Under cross-examination, the prosecution systematically dismantled whatever sympathy Dr. Holloway's testimony might have generated. Laritza asked pointed questions about the thousands of young people who came from difficult backgrounds without becoming murderers, about the choices that Aiden had made at every step of the path that led to Tristan's death. He challenged the expert to explain how any developmental deficit could account for 114 stab wounds, how any attachment disorder could produce a smirking selfie in the back of a police car. He asked whether her evaluation had found any evidence of genuine remorse, any indication that Aiden understood or cared about the suffering he had caused, and her hesitant, qualified answers spoke louder than any admission. By the time the cross-examination was complete, the defense's attempt at mitigation lay in tatters, another victim of the overwhelming evidence of their client's callousness. The defense made one final attempt to humanize their client, calling his father to the stand to speak on his behalf. It was a risky strategy, given the documented dysfunction of the family and the criminal charges that had been filed against Aiden's mother for her role in destroying evidence. But the defense hoped that a father's love might touch some chord of compassion that had survived the assault of damning evidence. Aiden's father approached the stand with the broken demeanor of a man whose life had collapsed around him, whose family had disintegrated into a nightmare from which there was no awakening. He spoke haltingly of his son as a child, of moments of connection that now seemed like fragments from another lifetime. He admitted to failures as a parent, to absences and inconsistencies that he now saw had contributed to the tragedy. He did not excuse what Aiden had done, could not bring himself to even directly reference the crime, but he asked the court to remember that his son was still young, still theoretically capable of change, still a human being beneath the monstrous actions that had brought them to this moment. His testimony was painful to witness. A father's love twisted into an impossible position. But it was not enough to shift the moral calculus of the courtroom. When the defense rested, a heavy silence settled over the proceedings. The time had come for the moment that everyone had been waiting for, the rendering of judgment upon Aiden Fucci. But first, there was one more ritual to observe. An opportunity for the defendant himself to address the court before sentencing was pronounced. Defense counsel had advised against it, knowing that their client's history of callousness made any public statement a risk. But Aiden had insisted, perhaps still believing in his ability to manipulate and perform his way out of consequences. The judge asked if the defendant wished to make a statement, and after a whispered conference with his attorneys, Aiden Fucci rose to his feet. What followed was a performance so transparently hollow that it damaged whatever slim chances the defense had preserved through their mitigation efforts. Aiden read from a prepared statement, his voice flat and mechanical. his eyes rarely lifting from the paper in his hands. He offered what were technically words of apology, expressions of remorse that checked the appropriate boxes without conveying any genuine emotion. He said he was sorry for what had happened, phrasing it in the passive voice as if he were a bystander to his own actions rather than their author. He said he thought about Tristan every day, a claim that his demeanor throughout the proceedings made difficult to believe. He said he hoped the Bailey family could find peace, though his tone suggested he was reciting a script rather than speaking from the heart. The words were correct, but they were empty, vessels without content, and everyone in the courtroom could hear the hollowness echoing within them. When he finished and sat down, the gulf between what he had said and what he had shown remained as vast as ever. The Bailey family's reaction to Aiden's statement was visible even from across the courtroom. Stacy Bailey shook her head slowly, her expression one of sad recognition rather than surprise. She had not expected genuine remorse and was not disappointed to receive manufactured platitudes instead. Matt Bailey's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists before he deliberately relaxed them, refusing to give the defendant the satisfaction of seeing his anger. The other family members and friends in the gallery exchanged glances that communicated without words, their shared understanding that what they had just witnessed was a charade, a final performance by a young man who had never learned to feel what he pretended to express. The moment passed, the ritual completed, and attention turned to the bench where Judge Smith sat, his expression grave, his hands folded before him as he prepared to deliver the words that would determine the rest of Aiden Fucci's life. Judge R. Lee Smith's sentencing statement began with an acknowledgement of the weight of the moment, the recognition that the words he was about to speak would echo through decades of consequences for all involved. He addressed the courtroom with the measured gravity of a jurist who understood that his role was not to express personal emotion, but to channel the law's response to an offense that had shaken an entire community. He began by summarizing the facts of the case, the evidence that had established beyond any doubt what had occurred on the early morning of May 9th, 2021. He spoke of the premeditation, the brutality, and the calculated cruelty that had characterized not just the crime itself, but the defendant's behavior in its aftermath. He noted that in his years on the bench, he had presided over many difficult cases, but few had demonstrated such a complete absence of the basic human capacity for empathy and remorse. His words were careful, precise, chosen with an awareness that they would become part of the permanent record of this case, read and studied long after the participants had left this courtroom. The judge then addressed the question of mitigation, the arguments the defense had presented in an attempt to justify a sentence less than the maximum. He acknowledged the expert testimony regarding Aiden's psychological profile and troubled upbringing, giving the defense the respect of engaging seriously with their arguments, rather than dismissing them outright. But he noted that millions of young people face difficult circumstances without resorting to violence, that the challenges of adolescence and the failures of parents, however real, could not excuse the deliberate decision to take a human life. He spoke directly to the issue of rehabilitation, the possibility that had been raised that Aiden might someday be capable of change, of becoming something other than the person who had committed this terrible act. And he concluded that nothing in the evidence before him, nothing in the defendant's behavior throughout these proceedings, suggested any realistic prospect of such transformation. The flat effect, the callous statements, the manufactured remorse of his statement to the court, all pointed to a young man fundamentally disconnected from the moral universe inhabited by normal human beings. When Judge Smith turned to the victim impact statements, his tone shifted slightly, becoming softer even as his words remained precise. He spoke of Tristan Bailey not as a victim in a legal proceeding, but as a child, a daughter, a friend, a member of a community that had been devastated by her loss. He acknowledged the courage of the Bailey family in sharing their grief with the court, the dignity they had maintained throughout proceedings that had forced them to relive their worst nightmare again and again. He noted that no sentence he could impose would bring Tristan back, would heal the wounds that had been inflicted on those who loved her, would restore what had been stolen on that terrible night. Justice, he observed, was an imperfect instrument, capable of accountability, but not restoration. of punishment, but not repair. But within the limits of what the law could provide, he was determined to deliver a sentence that reflected the full weight of this offense. The pronouncement of the sentence came with a finality that seemed to change the very air in the courtroom. Judge Smith looked directly at Aiden Fucci, his eyes meeting those of the defendant with an intensity that seemed to cut through the young man's carefully maintained facade. "Aiden Fucci," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent room. "You have pleaded guilty to the first-degree murder of Tristan Bailey. You took the life of a 13-year-old child with a brutality that shocks the conscience. You showed no mercy to your victim, and you have shown no genuine remorse for your actions. The evidence before this court demonstrates that you pose an unacceptable danger to the public, and that the interests of justice require the maximum sentence available under law." He paused, letting the moment stretch before delivering the words that would define the rest of Aiden Fucci's existence. "I hereby sentence you to life in prison, without the possibility of parole." The reaction in the courtroom was immediate but restrained, a collective release of breath that had been held through the long journey to this moment. The Bailey family embraced, their tears flowing freely now. A mixture of grief and relief that justice had been served, even if nothing could undo the injustice that had brought them here. Friends and supporters surrounded them, a community of shared sorrow that would continue long after the courtroom emptied. The prosecution team exchanged quiet nods of satisfaction. Their work completed. Their responsibility to Tristan Bailey's memory fulfilled. The media representatives hurried to file their reports, their keyboards and phones capturing the moment for audiences across the country who had followed this case from its terrible beginning to its solemn conclusion. At the defense table, the reaction was markedly different. Aiden Fucci sat motionless for a long moment, his expression unchanged, as if the words had not yet penetrated the barrier of his consciousness. Then, slowly, something shifted in his face. The mask of indifference that he had maintained throughout the proceedings began to crack, not with remorse, but with something closer to disbelief. For the first time since his arrest, the reality of his situation seemed to be penetrating his awareness. The understanding that his life, as he had known it, was over, that he would never again walk free, that the consequences he had always managed to evade had finally and irrevocably caught up with him. His eyes widened, his jaw slackened, and for a brief moment, the carefully constructed facade of adolescent cool crumbled entirely, revealing the terrified child beneath. But it was too late for such revelations to change anything. The sentence had been pronounced, the judgment rendered, and no display of emotion, genuine or otherwise, could alter what had been decided. The deputies moved to escort Aiden from the courtroom, their hands firm on his arms as he rose unsteadily from his chair. He looked around the room one final time, his eyes passing over the faces of the people whose lives he had shattered, the family members who would carry the weight of his actions for the rest of their days. For a moment, his gaze met Stacy Bailey's, mother to murderer, a connection across an unbridgeable chasm of pain and guilt. Then the deputies turned him toward the door, and he shuffled forward, his shackles clanking against the floor, his future reduced to a series of institutional corridors and locked cells that would be his world until he drew his final breath. The door closed behind him with a sound of finality that echoed in the silence of the courtroom, a punctuation mark at the end of a story that had no happy endings. In the aftermath of the sentencing, the participants in this tragedy began the long process of trying to rebuild lives that had been fundamentally altered. The Bailey family faced the challenge of learning to live with a grief that would never fully heal, of finding ways to honor Tristan's memory while somehow continuing to function in a world that seemed diminished by her absence. They channeled their pain into advocacy, working to improve child safety measures and mental health resources for teenagers, determined that their daughter's death would not be meaningless. Stacy Bailey became a spokeswoman for victims' rights, her eloquent testimony at the sentencing hearing the beginning of a public voice she never wanted but felt obligated to use. Matt Bailey returned to the quieter work of supporting his family. His grief, a private burden he carried with dignity, even as it threatened to overwhelm him. Their surviving children faced the impossible task of growing up in the shadow of tragedy, their sister's absence, a constant presence in their lives. Crystal Smith, Aiden's mother, served her prison sentence for evidence tampering, a consequence far lighter than what her actions deserved in the eyes of many who followed the case. When she emerged, she faced a world that viewed her with a mixture of pity and contempt, a mother whose protective instincts had led her to wash away a murdered child's blood in an attempt to save a son who was beyond saving. Her relationship with Aiden, such as it was, continued through the limited visitation allowed by the prison system, though what passed between them in those meetings remained private. Some speculated that she still clung to the illusion that her son was somehow redeemable, that the monster revealed in the courtroom was not the real Aiden but an aberration that might someday be corrected. Others suggested that she had finally accepted the truth, that her visits were a form of penance rather than hope. Either way, she had become a cautionary tale, a symbol of the dangers of parental denial taken to its criminal extreme. The community of Durban Crossing slowly began the process of healing, though the scars of what had happened would never fully fade. The neighborhood where Tristan had lived and died had been marked by tragedy, its reputation forever linked to the crime that had occurred within its boundaries. Property values fluctuated. Residents moved away, and new families moved in. And the community that emerged was different from the one that had existed before May 9th, 2021. Vigils and memorials became annual events, moments when the community gathered to remember what had been lost and to renew their commitment to the values that the crime had violated. The schools implemented new programs focused on identifying and addressing warning signs of violence, though everyone understood that no program could guarantee that such a tragedy would never recur. The illusion of suburban safety had been shattered, and what replaced it was something more complex. A recognition that evil could emerge anywhere, even in the most carefully constructed refuges from the world's darkness. In the years that followed the sentencing, the case of Aiden Fucci continued to resonate in discussions of juvenile justice, parental responsibility, and the nature of evil. Legal scholars analyzed the decision to try him as an adult, debating whether a 14-year-old could truly possess the moral culpability that the adult system presupposed. Psychologists studied his case as an example of antisocial personality development, attempting to identify the factors that had produced such a complete absence of empathy. Criminologists examined the role of social media in both the commission and the detection of the crime, noting how the same technology that had revealed Aiden's callousness had also helped bring him to justice. True crime enthusiasts dissected every detail, their fascination with the case sometimes crossing the line into exploitation that caused additional pain to those who had lived through it. The case became a reference point, a shorthand for discussions of youth violence and its causes, though no consensus emerged on what lessons should be drawn from it. The question of whether Aiden Fucci would ever truly understand what he had done remained unanswered, perhaps unanswerable. Prison psychologists continued to evaluate him, to probe for signs of the empathy and remorse that had been so conspicuously absent at his trial. Some reported small changes, moments when he seemed to engage more genuinely with the impact of his actions, though others dismissed these as manipulation, the learned behaviors of someone who had figured out what responses were expected. The flat effect that had characterized his courtroom demeanor softened slightly over time, though whether this represented genuine emotional development or simply the wearing away of adolescent defenses was unclear. He became, in some ways, a case study in the limits of rehabilitation, a test of whether someone who had demonstrated such complete moral vacancy could ever develop the capacity for genuine human connection. The answer, if there was one, would take decades to emerge, and by then, the world would have moved on to other horrors. For those closest to the tragedy, moving on was both a necessity and a betrayal. A daily negotiation between the need to continue living and the fear of forgetting. The Bailey family found ways to carry Tristan with them, her photograph a constant presence in their home, her memory invoked at gatherings and celebrations from which she was physically absent. Her younger siblings grew up hearing stories about the sister they had lost, constructing an image of her from photographs and anecdotes that could never capture the full reality of who she had been. Holidays became complicated negotiations between joy and sorrow. The empty chair at the table, a reminder that their family would forever be incomplete. And yet, life continued, because it had to. Because the alternative was to surrender to a grief that would consume everything. Children were born, milestones were reached, laughter returned in moments that felt both healing and guilty. The complex texture of grief that only those who have experienced it can truly understand. The Snapchat photo that had helped condemn Aiden Fucci became an enduring image, reproduced in countless articles and true crime programs. A symbol of the callousness that distinguished this case from others. The peace signs, the smirk, the caption asking if anyone had seen Tristan lately, all became icons of a particular kind of evil. The evil of someone who simply did not care. Parents showed the image to their children as a warning, a visual lesson in the reality that predators could look like anyone, even the kid down the street. Advocates used it in campaigns for better mental health screening, arguing that the warning signs had been visible long before the murder, if only someone had been willing to see them. The image became, in a strange way, more famous than either of the teenagers it depicted, a cultural artifact that had transcended its original context to become a symbol of something larger and more frightening. Aiden Fucci would spend the rest of his natural life behind the walls of a Florida state prison, his days structured by institutional routines that would never change, his world reduced to the narrow confines of cells and yards and visiting rooms. He would age there, growing from the teenager who had committed the crime into a middle-aged man and eventually an elderly one, his youth consumed by the consequences of a single night's violence. He would watch the world change through the filtered lens of incarceration, hearing about technological advances and social shifts that he would never experience. He would perhaps, in the deep solitude of his cell, begin to grasp what he had taken, not just from Tristan, but from himself, the decades of freedom and possibility that he had forfeited for reasons that even he might never fully understand. Or perhaps he would remain as he had been in the courtroom, hollow and unreachable, a mystery even to himself. Either way, his story had reached its conclusion, the final chapter written by a judge whose words had sealed his fate as surely as his own actions had sealed Tristan's. The legacy of the case would continue to evolve, shaped by changing perspectives and new contexts that no one could foresee. Future generations would study it as history, their understanding colored by the values and assumptions of their own time. The horror would fade, as all horror eventually does, becoming one case among many in the endless catalog of human cruelty. But for those who had lived through it, for the Bailey family and the community of Durbin Crossing and the investigators who had brought Aiden to justice, it would remain immediate, a wound that might close but would never fully heal. They would carry it with them, a burden and a responsibility. The knowledge that they had witnessed something terrible and survived it, changed but unbroken. And somewhere, in the quiet moments between the demands of daily life, they would remember Tristan Bailey, the cheerleader with the infectious laugh, the girl who had deserved a future and been robbed of it by someone who had no right to take it. In the end, what remained was not justice in any ultimate sense, for no sentence could restore what had been taken. No punishment could balance the scales that had been so violently tipped. What remained was accountability, the acknowledgement by society that such acts would not be tolerated, that those who committed them would face the full weight of consequences, even if those consequences could never be adequate to the offense. What remained was memory, the determination of those who loved Tristan to ensure that she would not be forgotten, that her life would be remembered as something more than its terrible ending. What remained was the slow, painful work of healing, the daily effort to find meaning and purpose in a world that had proven itself capable of senseless cruelty. And what remained, perhaps most importantly, was the love that had surrounded Tristan Bailey in life and that continued to surround her memory in death. a force more powerful than the violence that had tried to extinguish it, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of its darkest impulses. The courtroom where Aiden Fucci had been sentenced eventually hosted other trials, other dramas of justice and judgment that pushed his case further into the past. The participants scattered to their various fates, the prosecutors moving on to new cases, the defense attorneys taking on new clients, the investigators confronting new crimes that demanded their attention. The media coverage faded, replaced by new tragedies and scandals that captured the public's fickle attention. But in Johns County, in the homes and schools and streets of Durbin Crossing, the memory of what had happened remained close to the surface, a reminder of the fragility of the safety they had once taken for granted. Children who had known Tristan grew into adults carrying the weight of their early exposure to mortality. Parents who had hugged their children a little tighter in the days after the murder continued to feel that protective urgency, never quite able to forget how quickly everything could change. The community had been marked, branded by tragedy in a way that time could soften but never erase. And in a cell somewhere in the Florida correction system, Aiden Fucci continued to exist, his life reduced to the fundamentals of survival and the endless repetition of institutional routine. Whatever thoughts passed through his mind, whatever regrets or justifications or fantasies occupied his consciousness, remained his alone, locked away as surely as he was. He had become what the legal system had determined he should be, a prisoner serving a sentence that would end only with his death, his crime a matter of public record, his name forever linked to the horror he had perpetrated. The smirking teenager in the Snapchat photo had given way to an inmate number, a statistic in the correctional system, a cautionary tale for generations who would never know him as anything other than a symbol of youthful violence. His story had been told, judgment had been rendered, and the world had moved on. But Tristan Bailey's story continued, told by those who had loved her, shaped by the memories they preserved and the legacy they built in her name. She remained forever 13 in their hearts, frozen at the moment before everything changed, her potential infinite, because it would never be tested by the compromises and disappointments of actual life. She became, in death, something more than she could have been in life, a symbol of innocence lost, of futures stolen, of the terrible cost of violence. Her photograph smiled from memorial websites and foundation pages, her cheerleading uniform preserved as a relic of who she had been, her story told again and again to audiences who had never known her, but who were moved nonetheless. She had been taken too soon, in a manner too terrible to fully comprehend, but she would not be forgotten. That was the promise her family had made, the commitment that kept them going through the darkest days, the answer to the question of how to find meaning in meaningless tragedy. Tristan Bailey would be remembered, and in that remembrance, there was a victory over the darkness that had tried to extinguish her light, a triumph of love over hate, of memory over oblivion, of the human spirit over the forces that seek to destroy it.